A poet is found lifeless in a locked room. No wound, no poison, only a final whisper written in verse. In the shadows of London's literary elite, a curse is said to echo through ink, driving men to madness with a single sonnet. As fear coils around truth, a deeper deception lies hidden between the lines. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was upon a damp and sullen evening in the early days of November that I found myself once more in the familiar sitting room at Baker Street. The wind, though not fierce, carried with it the chill of premature winter, and the occasional rattle of shutters punctuated the silence with a kind of subdued menace. My companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, sat in his armchair with an unread newspaper upon his knee, his eyes fixed not upon the hearth, but on some fixed point far beyond the walls that enclosed us. He had spoken but once in the past hour, and though I was accustomed to his fits of abstraction, there was in his silence that evening a quality I could not name, some stillness too precise, too calculated to be mere idleness. "Watson," said Holmes suddenly without shifting his gaze, "we have just missed a gentleman of Gallic origin, recently arrived, slightly anxious, a pipe smoker of 2 tobaccos, and, if I am not mistaken, the owner of a rare Baudelairean volume." I stared at him. "Holmes, surely." "The traces are elementary," he said, lifting a slender finger. "The mud upon the front mat is of a pale ochre tint, chalky, consistent with the area near Charing Cross, where trains from Dover often deposit their passengers. The cigarette ash on the corner table is of 2 types, Turkish and a darker Cavendish, a curious blend favoured chiefly by the French intellectuals of the Quartier Latin. Moreover, someone, our unseen guest, placed a glove upon that chair's arm. Note the fine dusting of soot beside it, forming an impression only possible if a hand was recently withdrawn. And the book? An indentation left upon the side table leather, exactly matching the format of the edition de luxe of Les Fleurs du Mal, quarter-bound in crimson and gold. An eccentric choice for casual travel, but a telling one. I made to speak, but the bell at the street door rang sharply, cutting me short. Holmes did not move. "Ah," he said with the faintest smile, "and now comes Scotland Yard, 5 minutes behind the man they ought to have followed." Inspector Lestrade entered the room with that curious blend of purpose and unease that he so often exhibited when consulting Holmes. His coat bore traces of rain, and he held his bowler hat as if uncertain whether to apologize or to demand attention. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "I've a matter most unusual. A Frenchman's been found dead at the Hotel Saint Aubin, name of Julien Vereux. A poet of some repute, I'm told." Holmes nodded. "Go on." "No wound, no poison that we can detect. Nothing, save that he was found seated upright at his writing desk, a page clenched in his hand, and—" Here Lestrade hesitated, his voice lowering a fraction. His last words, according to the maid, were, "Beware the black verse." I could not help but glance at Holmes, but his expression remained inscrutable. "An odd case," Lestrade went on, "and not one I care to spend my nights explaining to foreign consuls or Fleet Street critics. The fellow was famous, it seems. Thought you might. Well, you know." Holmes rose slowly. "A poet's death, Inspector, may be a quiet matter, or an exceedingly loud one. You have done well to bring it here." When Lestrade had departed, and the door below had closed with its customary thud, Holmes remained standing by the fire, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. A most curious utterance. "The black verse," he mused aloud. "Not a title I recall among Vereux's published works. And yet the phrase carries with it a peculiar cadence. Less a name, I think, than a warning." "You don't suppose the man was mad?" I ventured. "Madness, Watson, is the common cloak of brilliance and deceit alike. But no, if he were raving, he would not have preserved the page, nor clutched it with such finality. There is something ritualistic in the act, something meant to be found. He paced slowly to the side table and examined the faint impression left by the visitor's book. A man who brings Baudelaire across the Channel in November does not die easily of natural causes. Holmes looked at me then, not with excitement, but with the quiet gravity I had come to associate with the most perplexing of cases. "Come, Watson," he said, "let us find out why poetry has begun to kill." The particulars of Julien Virot's death, as conveyed to us that night by Lestrade, and later confirmed through official reports, were as haunting as they were perplexing. Virot had been discovered in his suite at the Hotel Saint. Aubin, an establishment of respectable standing near Russell Square, seated at his desk with a sheet of paper tightly clenched in his left hand. There were no marks of violence upon the body, no signs of intrusion or disorder in the room, and, most curiously, no trace of poison discernible by the hotel physician who had been summoned at once. The door had been locked from within, and the windows latched securely. The room itself bore no immediate signs of disturbance, save for an overturned inkpot and a lingering trace of some foreign scent, described by the chambermaid as bittersweet, like burnt flowers. It was this final detail, I observed, that caused Holmes to lean forward slightly, his brows narrowing ever so faintly. An undisturbed scene, a locked door, and a dead man who leaves a cryptic phrase upon his lips, Holmes murmured. "Tell me, Watson, have you ever known verse to take a man's life?" I knew better than to answer hastily, for the question was not rhetorical, it was bait for something deeper to follow. No more than an hour had passed since Lestrade's departure, when Mrs. Hudson ushered in a slender man, pale of face and sombre of dress, whose presence cast a peculiar hush over the room. He removed his hat with a hand that trembled slightly and introduced himself in a soft, measured accent. "I am Lucien Cheval," he said, "publisher and friend to Monsieur Virot." Holmes gestured him to a chair without a word. The man sat stiffly, placing a leather valise across his knees, with the care of one carrying a wounded child. From its interior, he produced a sheaf of papers, several bound notebooks, and a pair of spectacles wrapped in silk. "He was not merely a client," Cheval said after a moment. "He was a soul of delicate genius, and he died in fear." It was not grief that coloured his voice, I thought, but something colder, perhaps guilt or dread. Holmes studied him closely, but said nothing. The silence lengthened, broken only by the soft rustle of vellum as Cheval laid the poet's possessions before us, as though presenting evidence to a tribunal. "He knew it would come," Cheval said softly, as if the admission cost him something. "He spoke of it often in the last month. Death, I mean. Not from illness nor accident, but from words, from something written, something that had been stolen." Holmes did not speak, but I could feel his attention sharpen like a scalpel beneath cloth. Cheval unfastened a ribbon that bound a stack of letters and slid one toward us. The handwriting was jagged and ink-blotted, the lines written in French with cryptic urgency. Holmes scanned the first page, then another. Each begins with the same phrase, he noted. "Ne ressuscitez pas le vers noir." Do not resurrect the black verse. "Yes," Cheval said. He received 5 in all, each more threatening than the last. He believed they came from Paris, perhaps from someone once known to him, but he would not name the source. "And what did he mean?" I asked. "By the black verse?" Cheval hesitated. "A poem," he said at last. "A lost one. He said it had been buried, literally, and that its return would bring ruin." There was, in that moment, something deeply unsettling in his tone, as if he himself had once read it and regretted having done so. I have published many strange things in my career, Cheval continued, but never have I heard my friend speak of anything with such dread as he did of that one poem. Holmes, who had been pacing the floor in quiet thought, turned to him. Did he describe its content? Cheval shook his head. Only obliquely. He claimed it was an early work, written in his youth, but suppressed. It was not simply controversial, but dangerous, he said. He spoke as if it possessed a kind of power, not magical, no, but psychological. He said it was capable of producing something like madness in certain readers. And yet it vanished, Holmes remarked. Yes. He claimed to have destroyed it years ago. But last month, he received a parcel with a single line of it enclosed, typed unsigned, unmistakably authentic. He paused, then added in a whisper. That was the moment he changed. From proud and brilliant to paranoid and silent. I could see Holmes's expression shift slightly. The tale, though steeped in literary melodrama, had begun to stir in him the unmistakable signs of interest, the tapping of fingers, the narrowing of eyes. Mr. Cheval, he said quietly, you have told me just enough to be believed, and too little to be dismissed. The fire had sunk low, and the last embers glowed like dying stars beneath the grate when Cheval at last gathered his papers and made to leave. Holmes stopped him at the door. Before you go, he said, a question, if you please. Did Verreaux believe this poem would be published? Cheval turned. He feared it would be by someone else. He told me once that if it saw the light of day, it would not be his hand that lifted it, but another's, a thief, or a disciple. Holmes inclined his head. Then we must find that hand. As the door closed behind our troubled visitor, I turned to Holmes. You mean to take this case? I mean to determine whether this death bears the mark of man or myth, Holmes replied. Superstition is a cloak worn by the cunning and feared by the innocent. I am interested in neither. And the poem? If it exists, he said, it is ink on paper. No more. Let us treat it as such. And with that, he returned to his chair. But I could see that his mind was already elsewhere. Somewhere between Paris and London. Poetry and poison. Ink and death. It was early the next morning when Holmes and I arrived at the Hotel Saint. Aubin, a solemn Georgian establishment tucked discreetly along the eastern fringe of Russell Square. A grey drizzle misted the panes as we ascended the stairs, guided by a reluctant concierge who appeared none too eager to revisit the scene of such a death. Suite 217 had been sealed by the local constable, but reopened at Holmes's quiet insistence. The moment we crossed the threshold, I was struck by the unnatural silence of the chamber, as though sound itself had been stilled by the man's passing. It was a modest yet refined room, appointed with the particular fussiness that the French seem to favour abroad. Yet beneath the polished surface there lingered a tension, like a breath held too long. Holmes moved with his usual precision, pausing first at the desk where Verreaux had been found. There remained the overturned inkpot we had heard of, its viscous remnants dried into a dull puddle near the blotter. A few scattered sheets of stationery, blank but for smudged corners, lay beside it. Holmes examined them beneath his lens, murmuring something about pressure marks. Note the candle stub, he said, gesturing, still clinging to the wax tray, though unused. He wrote in darkness, or perhaps he wrote nothing at all. He then turned his attention to the air itself. Do you smell it, Watson? I nodded. Something faint, sweet, yet acrid. Myrrh, Holmes said. Burnt, diluted, an incense not common in such rooms, certainly not provided by the hotel. He drifted toward the fireplace and crouched, inspecting the ash as though it might recite the room's final verse. Something was burnt here recently, and with haste. Note the quantity and layering. I watched as he sifted delicately through the cooled cinders. There is purpose in this scene, Watson. The kind of purpose that attempts to disguise itself as coincidence. Let us see if it succeeded. It was not long before Holmes extracted from the hearth a sliver of charred vellum, the edges curled inwards as though recoiling from their own destruction. He laid it carefully upon the windowsill, and I leaned in to inspect it alongside him. Only a single word remained discernible, Lucien inked in fine calligraphic hand, the final letter half swallowed by fire. A name, I said. Surely a reference to Lucien Cheval. Perhaps, Holmes replied, though his tone suggested doubt. But consider, Lucien is not so uncommon in the salons of Paris. It may be a reference, a signature, or even a misdirection. He lifted the scrap once more, tilting it toward the muted light. The paper is thick, high quality, likely personal correspondence or poetry. But the phrasing here, see the curl in the tail of the N, French trained, and yet, it was burned hastily, not ritually. Someone feared it might be found, but lacked time to be thorough. Why burn only a corner? Because the rest was taken, or interrupted mid-act. The answer lies not in what was destroyed, Watson, but in what was left. His eyes had already begun to gleam with the inward fire I had learned to recognize. Not of enthusiasm, but of recognition. A pattern was forming, and Holmes, as ever, had seen its shape before the rest of us had even lifted the brush. From the hotel, Holmes directed our next journey not towards Scotland Yard, as I had expected, but to the British Library, where, to my surprise, he requested access to a catalogue of Virot's published essays and correspondence, many of which had been archived there following the poet's rising fame in literary circles. Even the most secretive of men leave breadcrumbs, Watson, he said, as we were led to a quiet reading alcove, and poets, in particular, are slaves to the margins of their own pages. It was in the margins that Holmes now sought his answers. For more than an hour, he examined annotated volumes of Virot's essays and literary exchanges, his fingers deftly flipping pages, pausing only to copy cryptic notations into his pocketbook. I, for my part, saw little of worth. Half-written epigrams, exclamation points, snippets of untranslated Latin. But Holmes's gaze followed an invisible thread I could not yet perceive. This one, he said at last, holding up a heavily annotated essay on Baudelaire's influence upon the decadent poets of Paris. Here, in the side margin, never again to the circle without the raven's quill. Meaning, I asked. The circle may refer to a private literary society, possibly esoteric in nature, and the raven's quill, he smiled faintly. A symbol, perhaps a person, perhaps something darker. Several other volumes yielded similarly obscure markings, references to l'obscurité, the hidden chamber, and something Holmes translated as le corbeau noir, the black raven. He stood, slipping his notebook into his coat. This is not merely about a poem, Watson. It is about a world that writes in the shadows and reads between the lines. And with that, he stepped from the library as a man stepping deeper into fog, certain only of one thing, that something watched from within it. At Holmes's suggestion, I paid a visit the following morning to Lady Margaret Morley, an old acquaintance of Virot's and a patroness of the arts known for her reclusive intellect and her long-standing connections within continental literary circles. She received me in a drawing room furnished in pale velvets and heavy silks, a harp silent in the corner, its strings lightly dusted. I will not pretend Julian was an easy guest, she said, offering me a cup of tea her hands never quite ceased trembling to hold. He arrived with eyes too wide and sleep too shallow, the kind of nervous energy that clings to men who feel followed, even in solitude. She described how Virot had spent 3 days under her roof, a fortnight prior to his death, emerging from his room only at odd hours and speaking little, except when conversation turned to poetry. It was during one such talk, she recalled, that he mentioned a work long hidden, a sonnet never published, possibly never even finished. It was not pride that kept him from sharing it, she said, eyes clouding, but fear. He called it a wound wrapped in verse. At my urging, she retrieved from her escritoire a small envelope addressed in Virot's hand, but never posted. Within was a single line. I should not have exhumed it. Some bones do not like the light. Holmes later reviewed the line with interest, murmuring, he feared his own creation, or feared that another had already turned it against him. And indeed, the thought lingered in my mind long after I left that pale room, that a man of words could find in his own phrases the seeds of his undoing. Later that afternoon, we kept an appointment with one Victor Rasanur, whose name Holmes had unearthed during our library research as a once promising poet, now fallen into obscurity. He greeted us at a cafe in Soho with a sardonic smile and the faint odour of absinthe trailing his words. "Ah, Holmes," he said, "and the good doctor. Come to revive ghosts, have you?" Holmes offered no reply, but motioned for him to speak plainly. Rasanur laughed without mirth. "Julien Virot," he said, "was a thief. A brilliant thief, but a thief nonetheless. He took something from me 20 years ago and buried it in French silk. A poem, a dangerous one. I pressed him on this, but his tone grew sharp. It was mine, he hissed. A sonnet I wrote in my youth, careless, dark, hypnotic. He read it once, and I never saw it again. Years later, he published pieces that carried its shadow. I recognized the rhythm, the rhyme structure, the ache. And this poem, Holmes asked, what did it contain? Madness, Rasanur said simply. Not overt, but suggestions, lines that twist inward, a poem that listens back. He offered no evidence, only bitterness, and a clipped remark as he departed. You think him a victim, perhaps, but not an innocent. Holmes said little on our return, save to note, jealousy sharpens memory into invention, but not always without truth. Rasanur may be dangerous. Whether he is guilty is another matter. Yet I could not shake the unease stirred by the poet's claim, nor the conviction with which he delivered it. That evening, as the autumn mist crept once more against our windows and the fire hissed low in the grate, Holmes sat in his armchair with his notes spread before him in orderly disorder. I watched as he reviewed each item in turn, the incense at the hotel, the scrap of charred paper, the unpublished letter to Lady Morley, and the French marginalia from the library. Each clue appeared unrelated to the next, and yet in Holmes's mind, they were already joining into a lattice more coherent than my own imagination could yet discern. This is not, as it first appears, a crime of verse, he said finally. It is a crime of guilt, of perception. We are dealing with a mind bent not by supernatural suggestion, but by the suggestion of its own sins. He gestured to the word Lucian written upon the burnt scrap. We must consider that it may be not only a name, but a cipher, or a signature used by more than one man. Even the innocent, when named in fire, acquire the weight of suspicion. He stood and folded his notes. We are in the early stanzas of Something Larger, Watson. The cadence is slow, the rhyme still forming, but the refrain, I think, will not be written in ink. And so the night drew on, with London exhaling her damp breath upon our panes, and Holmes already pacing a step ahead of a killer who had left no trace, save for the lingering scent of poetry and the promise of another line yet to be written. It was not long after our visit to Victor Rasanur that the second death was reported. The young man, a literary translator by the name of Émile Gravois, had been found lifeless in his modest rooms off Gray's Inn Road. The landlady, who had grown concerned after 2 days without response, had summoned the police when the door remained locked from within. The scene was tragically reminiscent of Virot's. Gravois was found seated at his desk, head slumped forward, a half-written page beneath him, and a jet-black quill still gripped between his stiffened fingers. The windows were shut, the door locked. There were no bruises, no wounds, no toxic agents discovered in his tea or ink. The cause was ruled, perhaps too swiftly, as suicide. Holmes, upon hearing the details from Lestrade, insisted we visit the scene. The air was stagnant, infused faintly with the scent of ink and something less identifiable, what Holmes called a chemical hint, masked by the ordinary. He examined the quill first. The shaft was unusually dark, nearly lacquered, but Holmes scraped at it gently and observed a faint discoloration on the fingertips of the deceased. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you recall the pigment I mentioned? The one used only in the rarest of Parisian calligraphic shops? I would wager we are looking at it once more." I was struck then by the eerie similarity of posture between the two deaths, as though compelled by something unseen to assume that last repose at the desk. Holmes straightened slowly. "This is not coincidence. It is method, ritual perhaps, and someone is counting on it to pass as madness." And so the line between the poetic and the deadly grew thinner still. In the days that followed, London's literary world, never far from hysteria, when scandal is tinged with mystique, began to hum with unease. Word spread quickly that the death of Julien Vireux had been followed by that of his English translator, and that both men had been in possession, however briefly, of the same dangerous poem. Whispers turned to paragraphs, and soon small literary periodicals carried cautious lines about the poem that sees. Others, more dramatic, dubbed it the black verse and suggested a lineage of suicides that stretched back to the cafés of Montmartre. Of course, no proof accompanied these claims, but rumour rarely asks for evidence when dread does the work. At literary salons in Bloomsbury and Hampstead, writers speculated darkly over wine and candlelight, and the more sensitive among them refused to speak Vireux's name altogether. It was even said that one editor had gone so far as to burn a bundle of unpublished translations sent by the poet mere weeks before his death. Holmes took no stock in these rumours, yet he observed them keenly. "A myth, once whispered," he remarked, "travels faster than fact, and we must discern who benefits from that myth's widening wingspan." That very evening, we called unannounced upon Lucien Cheval at his temporary lodgings in Bloomsbury. The parlour into which we were received was lit only by candlelight, and Cheval appeared pale and withdrawn, as though sleep had become a stranger to him. The faint trace of myrrh lingered in the room, unacknowledged. Holmes wasted no time in pleasantries. He removed from his coat the charred remnant retrieved from the fireplace, and laid it silently upon the table between them. Cheval's eyes widened before he could contain the reaction. "I found this in Vireux's hearth," Holmes said. "It bears your name, burned in haste but not destroyed. Would you care to explain?" Cheval's mouth opened, closed. For a moment he seemed on the verge of denying everything, but something in Holmes's gaze undid him. He collapsed into the chair behind him. "I did not kill him," he said hoarsely. "I swear it. But, yes, we quarrelled. About the poem." "What poem?" "You know already," Cheval muttered. He found it again. "The black verse." Holmes stepped closer. "Found?" Then it had been lost. Cheval nodded slowly. "Hidden, concealed, I should say, but not destroyed." "And you burned this note," Holmes said, tapping the fragment, "to protect him, or yourself?" Cheval looked up with hollow eyes. "What would you have done, Mr. Holmes, if you held a match in one hand and madness in the other?" Holmes said nothing, but in the drawn lines of his face, I saw the flicker of something that was not pity, but understanding. Cheval's voice trembled as he recounted what Vireux had confessed to him only days before his death. He found it, he said, tucked into the back cover of a rare 1839 edition of Les Fleurs du Mal, rebound in Paris and sold through private channels. Holmes arched a brow. Not inserted by the publisher? No, Cheval replied. It had been sewn into the spine, a single folded sheet written in Vireau's own early hand, though he claimed not to remember when or why he had composed it. He called it a thing born in fever, not thought. There are only 2 other known copies of that edition, he continued. One is in the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal in Paris. The other, I do not know. Vireau feared that whoever sent the letters, whoever sent the line, had the third Holmes nodded slowly. And the content of the verse? Cheval hesitated. I never saw it. He wouldn't allow it. He said it could injure, not merely offend. That its rhyme was like a bell rung too close to the ear. It would echo long after the sound ceased. For a brief moment, even Holmes was silent. Then he said, almost to himself, a poem designed not to be read, but to remain, lodged in the mind. And with that chilling idea, we departed, the image of ink sewn into a spine lingering like a wound unhealed. The following morning found Holmes in possession of a small but vital lead. A brief note from an associate at the Muses Circle, a private literary society known for its exclusivity and obscurantist leanings, confirmed that Julien Vireau had attended a meeting 3 weeks before his death under a borrowed name. With some persuasion and a discreet favour, Holmes obtained access to the society's guest registry. The ledger, aged and ornately scripted, revealed a list of names both illustrious and obscure. But Holmes skimmed past them all until he stopped at a single line, recorded in a faint but deliberate hand, Le Corbeau Noir. The Black Raven, I translated, leaning over his shoulder. A pseudonym, Holmes replied. One I've encountered before, a literary alias adopted by several anonymous contributors in Paris. Always shadowy, always provocative, and always aligned with fringe movements in the poetic underground. He tapped the name. But this is the first time I have seen it travel. Holmes's fingers traced the ink. If this person was present, they may have passed the poem to Vireau, or worse, they may have taken it back. I glanced again at the name, oddly chilled by the sight of it. Do you believe this Raven, whoever he is, has killed? I believe, Holmes said slowly, that he has written something more dangerous than most men dare read, and if he means to silence those who hold it, then he has not finished yet. With that grim deduction, Holmes closed the ledger. It is time, Watson, he said, that we stopped reading shadows and started casting them. It was just after tea the following afternoon when Mrs. Hudson entered with a face paler than usual and handed Holmes a small envelope, unmarked, save for our address, and sealed with a thick blot of crimson wax. Holmes broke it silently, unfolded the paper within, and read in a tone void of affectation, but sharpened with interest. Leave ink to silence, leave death to the grave, or rhyme shall be yours in a whispering wave. The quill that writes truth, if dipped in your name, shall carve your epitaph in poetic flame. He held it out for me to read. I confess the verses struck a chord of genuine unease, their rhythm hauntingly precise, their tone unmistakably familiar. Vireau's meter, I murmured. Imitated, but not original, Holmes replied. A studied mimicry, one almost too precise. The author intends not to inspire awe, but fear. The letter was unsigned, but the ciphering method, the rhymed couplets interwoven with internal consonants, suggested intimate literary knowledge, perhaps even a formal education in French poetics. Holmes laid the letter beside his notes and lit his pipe. This, Watson, is not mere menace. It is art as a weapon, and the fact that it has arrived here upon our hearth tells us the next stanza will not be written from a distance. And indeed, we would not have to wait long for the hand that penned it to strike nearer still. That night, long after Holmes had retired to his chair and I to the pages of my own diary, a sound, a shift in the draft, subtle as breath, startled me. I emerged from my room to find Holmes already at his desk, one hand resting beside the cold handle of his revolver. "Nothing taken," he said softly, gesturing toward the hearth. "But something left." Upon the blotter lay a single folded page, creamy and uncreased, its edge tucked beneath the carved base of Holmes's paperweight. Holmes opened it with great care. It was a stanza. "The sun sets red where minds decay, and ink drinks souls that lose their way. Beware the line that bleeds unseen, for madness sleeps where thought has been." Holmes's expression hardened. "This line," he said, pointing to the third verse, "is not original. It is a mutation, lifted from the black verse, but altered, weaponized." "No signs of forced entry," I noted, peering at the latch and sill. "Of course not," Holmes replied. "A guest with keys, or hands deft enough to mimic permission." And then, almost absently, "We are being watched, Watson. Not as investigators, but as characters. Someone is scripting this with dangerous intention." The following morning saw Holmes at his most exacting. While I finished my breakfast in silence, he examined the original burnt paper from Vireau's fireplace, the anonymous threat from the day prior, and the stanza left in the night, all under his chemical lens, side by side, in search of what he termed the unseen residue of madness. It did not take him long. "There," he said, indicating a subtle bloom of purple-red that appeared only under a rare alcohol-based reagent, a specific tannin-based pigment, industrially rare, organic in origin, Parisian in its recipe. I watched as he cross-referenced an index of rare inks he had compiled over the years. His finger stopped at a single line. "Sold only," he said, "at La Plume Obscure, a small calligraphy boutique in the 6th arrondissement. Known for custom blends, primarily to poets and dramatists." He pulled from a drawer the earlier letter from Vireau's belongings, written shortly before his death. A light wash of the reagent revealed the same trace signature. "Watson," he said, "the ink is our thread. Whoever has handled all three of these documents has left not fingerprints, but authorship." The room fell into silence once more, but now the quiet felt strained, like breath held too long between stanzas. It was I who received the news first. A messenger from the French consulate arrived at our door, breathless and dishevelled, with a telegram in hand. The message, hastily scrawled, bore the seal of the local precinct and contained but 3 lines. "Lucien Cheval missing. Flat ransacked. Blood and ink upon the wall." We departed at once. Cheval's Bloomsbury lodgings, once dim and fragrant with myrrh, now stood hollow and torn. The door had been forced, the curtains ripped from their fastenings, and the desk lay overturned. Its drawers yawned open like mouths mid-scream. Scattered among the chaos were torn pages, shattered ink bottles, and the fragments of Cheval's black leather valise. But it was the wall that held our attention. In looping script, written in alternating lines of dark red and black, was a passage from Les Fleurs du Mal, one I recognized from my medical days for its grim meditation on spiritual rot. "J'ai vu parfois au fond d'un théâtre banal un être qui semblait issu du cauchemar." Holmes translated under his breath. "I have seen at times in the back of a banal theatre a being who seemed born of nightmare." The irony was not lost on him. "He was taken," Holmes said flatly. "This is not a man fleeing. It is a man silenced." And indeed, Cheval would not be heard from again. For the remainder of our inquiry, his absence would press on us more heavily than his presence ever had. Back at Baker Street, Holmes stood before the hearth, arms folded, mind alight. Around him were laid out the fragments of a mind's theatre, the charred note, the verse on our desk, the ink samples, the registry of the Muses' circle, and the cryptic stanza smeared in blood and Baudelaire. The pattern is no longer symbolic, he murmured. It is personal. He turned to me, eyes sharp. Each act is a line in a poem of control, of vengeance masked as art. Our criminal is not merely a murderer, Watson. He is a dramatist, penning a tragedy in real time. I must admit, when Holmes announced his intention to host a private poetry reading beneath the dome of the British Museum, I suspected a stroke of theatricality. But as he laid out the invitations with clinical precision and summoned both Scotland Yard and a handful of literary notables, I understood that this was no indulgence. It was strategy. The room reserved was modest but dignified. By candlelight, its stone alcoves took on the air of a crypt, and the low hum of whispered speculation made it feel almost sacred. Among those gathered were critics, editors, poets, and one or two who bore the unmistakable mark of a darker curiosity. At the centre, dressed in subdued grey, stood Holmes. He offered no pleasantries, merely the promise that the cursed poem, the black verse, had been recovered, deciphered, and would now be read aloud for the first time since its composition. The stir that followed was a symphony of thrill and dread. Seated toward the rear was Victor Rasanur. His eyes, though calm in posture, betrayed a flicker of discomfort beneath their surface. He was dressed in black as always, and fiddled absently with the signet ring upon his finger. Holmes did not glance in his direction. He merely nodded once, and the candles were dimmed. Words, he began, can wound more deeply than the blade, and it is often not the verse, but the silence between lines that undoes a man. And with that, he began to recite. Holmes's voice, firm yet strangely elegiac, filled the chamber like smoke curling through a chapel. The poem he spoke was not real, at least not in the way the audience believed. It was a pastiche, a carefully crafted echo of Virot's style, laced with the gloom of Baudelaire and the rhythm of a mind teetering on despair. Beneath the bloom of opal skies, where thought decays and silence lies, a quill may bleed though hands are dry, and madness where a poet's cry. The air grew colder, or so it felt. One by one, heads tilted, expressions grew grave. Some sat rapt with admiration, others with visible discomfort. And then Holmes paused, long enough to draw the room into the stillness before a storm. He continued, "What rhyme remains when reason dies? Who sings when breath itself denies?" A final line, unseen, unheard. The curse is not the verse, but word. There was no curse, no madness, only suggestion, artifice, and tone. And yet, in the mirror of the audience's gaze, the illusion took root. The poem became what it claimed to be, and that, I realized, was precisely Holmes's intention. The moment came swiftly. As Holmes approached the final verse, the air thick with dreadful expectation, a sudden motion in the back of the room drew every eye. Victor Rasanur had risen from his chair, too quickly, too loudly. His face was pale as bone, and a tremor shook his outstretched hand, as if to shield himself from an invisible blow. He turned on his heel, pushing past an astonished editor, and made for the doors with haste that bordered on desperation. But Holmes was already moving. Before Rasanur could reach the corridor, a hand grasped his shoulder, firm, unshaking. The poet stopped, his frame frozen in a rictus of panic. "I rather thought," Holmes said coolly, "you would find the final stanza unbearable." The room remained hushed as two plainclothes officers emerged from the shadows. Rasanur did not resist. He merely turned his face away and whispered, "He stole everything, even silence," and with that, the curtain fell, not upon a poem, but upon a man. In the privacy of a museum chamber set aside for ancient manuscripts, Holmes conducted his confrontation not as a constable, but as a surgeon, cutting with logic, not accusation. "You wrote the original poem, did you not?" he said calmly, and entrusted it, in a moment of misguided admiration, to Julien Vireux. Rasanur sat with his hands clenched, the remnants of a carefully cultivated aloofness now stripped bare. "It was mine," he murmured. "Every word. I gave it to him as a gift. He said he would honour it. Instead, he buried it." Holmes inclined his head. "Not out of theft, but fear. He killed it," Rasanur spat. "Said it was dangerous. He smothered its voice and let me drown in silence." Watson, myself, watched in astonishment as the vehemence gave way to grief. "So you created the myth," Holmes continued. "You fed the whispers, penned the warnings, forged the letters, each calculated to elevate the poem into legend, to make it live again in terror." Rasanur looked away. "They feared what they imagined. That was the only power I had left." Holmes's tone did not waver. "And Cheval, I never meant to kill him," he said softly, but he wouldn't let go. Holmes turned to me after Rasanur had been led away. He gestured to the documents upon the table, the threatening poem, the scorched page, the stanza left at our flat. "All written," he said, "in the same rare ink, a blend infused with a trace neurotoxin, absorbed through the skin. Not fatal, but capable of inducing tremors, hallucinations, and paranoia in the vulnerable." I recalled the translator's blackened quill. The ink had bled more than colour. It had whispered fear. "Rasanur did not need to strike," Holmes said. "He merely suggested. He understood how to compose a death without lifting a blade. Symbolism was his scalpel." "And the poem?" I asked. He smiled thinly. "There never was a curse. Only a man who knew that belief, especially poetic belief, is the most fertile ground in which to sow madness." The chamber into which Holmes led Victor Rasanur was reserved for rare manuscripts, its walls lined with folios bound in calfskin, and its table smooth with decades of reverent handling. Here, beneath the gazes of forgotten scholars, Holmes prepared to lay bare a crime not of blood, but of intellect and vengeance. Rasanur, pale yet composed, sat at the far end of the oak table, hands folded tightly before him. Holmes stood opposite, his voice neither accusatory nor cruel, merely precise, as though lecturing upon some impersonal case study. "You see," Holmes began, "the ink was the thread, rare, obscure and chemically reactive to tannins, sold only in a single Parisian shop known to both you and Vireux." He laid down the 3 samples, the scorched edge from the hotel, the stanza left in our flat, and the so-called black verse, all marked with the same hidden signature. "And then," he continued, "the verse itself, constructed not merely in Vireux's rhythm, but in your voice, Mr. Rasanur, your meter, your linguistic fingerprints." Victor said nothing. Holmes then drew out the final sheet, the fabricated poem he had read at the gathering. "And this," he said, "was never written by Vireux. I composed it. Yet it was this poem that made you flee." A pause. "You recognized yourself, Mr. Rasanur, not in the words, but in the betrayal they mirrored." Victor flinched, and for the first time, lowered his eyes. The silence that followed was not long, but it hung heavily, as if the very books around us awaited his reply. Victor's hands unclasped. He took in a breath, long, quivering, and when he finally spoke, it was not in defiance, but in something perilously close to mourning. "I wrote it," he said. Years ago, when I was nothing but a student chasing shadows in Montmartre. I gave it to Julian. I admired him, you know. I thought he would understand." His voice faltered. "He read it once, and he was afraid. He told me it should never be seen again, that it had a sickness in it. He took it from me and buried it, as though my soul were a disease." He looked up then, his eyes not pleading but bare. "He took more than a poem. He took the only truth I had ever carved, and then he wrote his own name above the grave." I said nothing. Holmes watched in utter stillness. Victor went on. "I tried to forget. I even convinced myself that perhaps he was right. But then came the reviews, the lectures, the fame. And all the while, the world praised him for a depth of darkness he had not earned." He smiled bitterly. "So I gave it back to him, the poem. Piece by piece, whisper by whisper. I let it haunt him, and when he could no longer bear it, he died clutching what he had once condemned." He closed his eyes. "It was not murder, it was restitution." The door opened quietly, and Inspector Lestrade entered with 2 constables in tow. Holmes gave a slight nod. Victor Rasanur stood without protest. There was no struggle, no resistance, only the hollow bearing of a man whose confession had left him already undone. As the officers moved to flank him, he turned once more toward Holmes. "You do not understand," he said, almost gently. "I understand all too well," Holmes replied. "It is not truth that kills, Mr. Rasanur. It is silence, and what men choose to place within it." Victor did not respond. As they led him away, he paused at the threshold, glanced at me, and recited in a low, reverent voice, "A poem must end. But its echo, that belongs to no man." And then he was gone. I remained still for some time after, shaken not by the violence of the affair, there had been none, but by the emotional carnage that such a quiet revenge had wrought. Holmes resumed his seat at the table and began collecting the documents, his face unreadable. "Your thoughts, Holmes?" I asked. He glanced toward the door and said, "A tragedy penned with precision. And like all well-written tragedies, Watson, inevitable." We returned to Baker Street well past midnight, the fog clinging low along the lamplit roads like the final breath of a vanished dream. Holmes, as ever, removed his coat with no flourish, lit his pipe with calm precision, and took his place before the fire, cross-legged and distant in thought. I, still somewhat shaken by the emotional charge of Victor's confession, poured us each a measure of brandy and took my chair opposite. The familiar ticking of the mantel clock filled the room. Outside, the occasional rattle of hooves along the cobblestones reminded us that the world carried on, indifferent to the dark poetry that had so recently played out behind closed doors. Holmes sat for some time in silence, the blue wisp of his pipe curling upward, before he finally spoke. "It is always the quiet crimes, Watson," he said, "that require the loudest logic." He turned his gaze to me, not sharply, but with the composure of a man who now possessed the full, unbroken thread. "Shall we unravel it then, from the first drop of ink to the final line?" And so he began, calmly and without vanity. "It began," Holmes said, "with the ink." He opened the notebook on his lap and drew forth 3 slivers of paper, all carefully numbered and preserved. "This pigment," he continued, tapping the first, "is rare to the point of obscurity. A Parisian blend once used by monastic scribes, laced with myrrh oil and an iridescent agent. It reacts faintly under heat, and more intriguingly, can pass through the skin if handled in quantity. The same ink," I remarked, "was used on the scorched fragment in Vireux's room, the poem left at our flat, and the line written in blood at Cheval's lodgings." "Precisely," Holmes nodded, "though the final was not blood alone. It was a mixture, ink and lamb's serum, meant to appear theatrical and to terrify. He leaned forward slightly. Victor crafted each scene with care, the poem in the dead man's hand, the quills stained and placed deliberately, the sinister whispers in literary circles, none of it accidental. Each act was a verse in his performance, designed to blur the line between fiction and consequence. And all to resurrect a forgotten poem, I murmured. No, Holmes corrected. To resurrect himself. Victor did not want fame. He wanted vengeance on the world that ignored his voice and on the man who silenced it. It is a dangerous thing, Holmes said, to wound a man's vanity, more so when that vanity is dressed in art. He turned to the mantel where Les Fleurs du Mal rested, its spine worn but dignified. Virot was no thief, but he was a coward. He feared what Victor had written, perhaps rightly so, and believed that by burying it, he could protect his reputation and perhaps the minds of others. And yet, it was that very suppression that bred the myth, I said. Indeed, Holmes replied. Victor needed no supernatural curse. He understood the appetite of men who yearn for mystery. A few anonymous letters, a well-timed stanza, and he watched the world weave its own noose. He set down the final fragment. Virot's death was not from ink nor poison. It was guilt, Watson. Guilt sharpened by fear, fear dressed as fate. A man may die of a whisper if he believes it loud enough. There was silence again, and then Holmes added, the black verse never needed to be read aloud. It had already been written into their minds. And what of Cheval? I asked after a time. Holmes gave a faint shrug. Lucien Cheval was never guilty of conspiracy, merely of silence. He rose and began pacing lightly before the fire. He knew Virot feared something. He suspected, perhaps even discovered, Victor's authorship. But he did nothing, said nothing. And when the whisper became a storm, he simply hid. Holmes glanced toward the window, his tone unmoved. The burnt paper bearing his name was not a cry for justice. It was a misdirection. Victor needed a scapegoat, someone plausible, yet powerless. Cheval fit the role well. And so he vanished. Out of fear, Holmes affirmed. Men often flee not from guilt, but from the expectation of it. He paused, then said, Victor's crime was artful, but Cheval's was cowardice, and with that, Holmes fell silent once more. The gaslights flickered low, casting long shadows upon the bookshelves of Baker Street, where the case had found its end, but not its rest. Holmes sat motionless by the hearth, his lean fingers curled about a slim volume of verse, its pages yellowed but unbent. Les Fleurs du Mal, once the possession of a tormented soul, now rested in the hands of the only man I knew who could examine it without surrendering to its melancholic sway. The fire snapped softly, as though punctuating some internal monologue Holmes had no wish to share aloud. Outside, the fog moved in silent drifts across the window pane, shrouding the city in its accustomed hush. I did not speak. The silence between us was not one of absence, but of understanding. An understanding forged not in gunfire or gallows, but in a rhyme, ink, and the madness that too often follows both. Holmes, without glancing up, turned a page with the same precision he might have used to reload a revolver. After a moment he said, "There is a peculiar alchemy in language, Watson. The mind is not made to guard against the subtlety of suggestion." I looked up from my own idle notepad. "A blade wounds," he continued, "but only at the point of contact. A verse, when properly turned, may lie dormant for years, until the hearer's own fears bring it to life." He tapped the cover of the book lightly. This was never about murder in the traditional sense. Victor used the quill not as poet, but as puppeteer, pulling at the unseen fibers of belief. "Then you consider the curse real?" I asked. He smiled faintly. no more real than any lie repeated with sufficient conviction. But I do not dismiss its effects. There was a pause. Then he added, as if to himself, "The sharpest quill is not the one that writes truth, Watson, but the one that convinces men to believe it." It struck me then, as I watched him, this man who scoffed at illusion, yet understood it more intimately than any dramatist or dreamer, that Sherlock Holmes was not untouched by poetry. He merely refused to be mastered by it. He saw art not as truth, but as terrain, a map of emotion, of motive, of misdirection. Where others read to feel, he read to know. Where others wept, he reasoned. And yet, even reason bears its solitude. As the fire faded into coals, Holmes closed the book and set it aside. "Enough verse," he said simply. "The world will write another." I rose, taking up my coat. Outside, London's fog still held its grip, but Baker Street felt, if only for a breath, warmer for the truth we had wrested from myth. And so the case was closed. But the black verse, I fear, shall never wholly sleep. As the last embers crumbled in the grate, Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Words, Watson," he said quietly, "are curious weapons. A man may carry a revolver for protection, but it is the pen, misused, that inflicts subtler, more lasting wounds. Our murderer knew this. He understood that belief, when nurtured by fear, can achieve what brute force never could." I nodded, still haunted by Victor's trembling confession. "And yet," Holmes added, "no sonnet, however dark, ever compelled a man to madness. It is not the verse that is cursed. It is the vanity behind it." What do you think was the criminal's gravest misstep? Writing the poem at all, or trusting it would remain forgotten? Let us know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this case and would like more mysteries unraveled by Holmes and Watson, do subscribe and share this story with a fellow lover of deduction. Until next time, the game remains afoot.